Hello, this is the Fedora Files, and I am Gregory Fedora. Today we're going to talk about wizards. Yes, wizards, powerful and mysterious. In the Chronicles of Illustrious Wizards, you've got the great and powerful Oz, Gandalf the Grey, and more recently, Harry Potter. But those are just fictitious incarnations of what storytellers thought wizards would be like. There was, however, one man who gained the title of wizard while living his life in the shadow of South Mountain, deep in western Maryland. He was a wizard you may never have heard of. His name was Michael Zittle Jr. The wizard Zyto was born sometime after 1798 and garnered acclaim in the 19th century as the Wizard of South Mountain for his use of magic, charms, and incantations to heal or manipulate his neighbors. He was a healer to some and a hex maker to others. He was adored and feared, it seemed, which I guess is a sign of a good wizard. Whether he was a caring soul who used his sorcery for good or he was a prolific maker of mischief depends on what source of information you gravitate towards and believe. Now, before we dive into who Michael Zittle was, let's look into the Zytos of Zyto Town. Yes, they had their own little town or village right on South Mountain. You see, a little over a mile from Boonesboro, Maryland, just past the Frederick County line on alternate US 40, a road sign identifies the community of Zyto Town. It's not much more than a collection of homes from antiquity, a church and some farms snuggled on the mountain in the vicinity of Washington Monument State Park. In the late 18th century, the Pennsylvania Dutch Zyto family settled on the mountain. They brought with them old country beliefs, rituals, superstitions, and at some point, Michael Zittle Jr., the son of the group's patriarch, came into possession of a strange book of charms, potions, and incantations he used, apparently, to great effect on family, neighbors, and the occasional traveler to cure all sorts of problems and ailments. Where the book came from is still up for debate. Zytle's conjuring book was written in German and was aggressively cryptic. A preface laid it on thick, claiming the spells were based on the secret tricks found in an ancient Spanish manuscript, which was discovered by an old hermit over 100 years ago, hidden among the mysteries of the Holy Land, which makes it even crazier because the Holy Land, they would have spoken Aramaic or Hebrew or possibly Latin, but hey, this was in Spanish, so whatever. Okay, now within this magic book, the wizard Zyto had a few hexes to stop bleeding, a spell to cure wounds, and a ceremony to cure the sweeney. Now, the sweeney was a strain or inflammation of the gums. Basically, folks back then had the oral hygiene of zero, and their gums would bleed, and eventually their teeth would fall out. So the thing is, always brush and floss, unless of course you have a wizard that can make your teeth all pretty again. More than likely you don't, so brush and floss, kids, okay? It's good, it's important. Your smile is everything. Okay, enough about oral hygiene. Let's move back on into the story. Zyto seemed to have an eager audience. People on the mountain believed in this Pennsylvania Dutch folk magic, or as it was called, powwow, well into the 20th century, according to historian Doug Bass, who has a copy of Zyto's little book in his Boonesboro Museum of History. So go check that out if you're ever in Boonesboro. South Mountain was a mystical place full of dark intrigue and enchantment. The mountain was, after all, the haunt of the Snallygaster, the Hex Wolf, also known as the Dweyo, and the Snarly Yowl, which I will have to dive into at another time. It also had various other ghosts, goblins, and specters, all wandering about the woods. To the people of the area, charms and talismans carried heavy weight and were thought to be important in protecting from all the evil spirits that lurked about, preying upon the unwitting who wandered into their presence. Or as late 19th century writer Madeline Vinton Dahlgren remarked, ignorance tainted by the belief in magic has taken the unearthly form of superstition. Miss Dahlgren wrote those words in her book, South Mountain Magic. She arrived in the area shortly before the wizard Zyto died, and while she regarded him as the high priest of all the evil practice, her inquisitiveness seems to have gotten the best of her. She managed to finagle a glimpse at Zyto's conjuring book from an old woman to whom Zyto had lent it, and relayed some of its spells in her own book, South Mountain Magic. Basically, Mrs. Dahlgren was like, spells are bad, but hey, if I throw a few of these spells in my book, it might sell more copies. So, whatever, bad spells equals profit. But even though she did that, Mrs. Dahlgren was highly critical of both the wizard's book and Zyto himself as a practitioner of the black arts, as she considered him kind of a warlock of sorts. Part of his book of hexes and spells, she said, were too blasphemous to be given a rendering. However, Mrs. Dahlgren did note that there were many references to the cross and the Holy Trinity throughout the book. She wrote, "It seems to us that an impious use of holy names and sacrilegious allusions to the sufferings of the Savior from the substance or warp and woof of the system." Mrs. Dahlgren also wrote, "This fact makes us believe that if direct results of this agency were really obtained as claimed, the power that gave them efficacy was in its nature satanic." Well, now let's jump ahead about 100 years later to 1950s. That is when George Wetzel, another author, reviewed all of the evidence and decided Dahlgren had been a little too hard on the good old man Zyto. He came to the conclusion that actually this man Zyto was a sort of faith healer, and if this magic book helped in his cures, it was a species of white magic, not black. Mrs. Dahlgren, therefore, has mistakenly characterized a good and kindly man as an unholy dabbler and a humbug. Historian Doug Bass noted that this mix of faith and superstition, or what local author Susan Fair describes as quirky combination of Christianity and sorcery, was rampant on the mountain. Families, including the Zytles, would hang open scissors outside their homes, for example, to ward off evil. It was believed that these pointed objects would protect you from witchcraft. Interestingly, many early churches had multiple pointed steeples on their churches in hopes of keeping evil from infiltrating the church. If you go throughout New England and up north, you'll see a lot of these. You'll see like a church with 8, 9, 10 pointed steeples. It's pretty cool. And then to find out why is even more interesting. Doug Bass pointed out that to the Zytles, the cross was very important in their beliefs. In fact, in early pictures of the Zyto home, there's a pair of scissors opened up, and those scissors signified a cross. The family seemed to want to make sure that evil was nowhere on their property. The reason for that is that folks living around South Mountain seemed to be a mischievous bunch, and were always trying to mess with one another. They would actually try to get into your house and then leave a spell or hex or an item so that some kind of unpleasant being or demon would begin to cause havoc, and nobody would know what it was and why. A pair of scissors hung at the door was believed to protect the home from such intrusion, especially one blessed by the good wizard Zyto. It wasn't so much that these neighbors and families on South Mountain were combative with each other, but they liked to have a little power over one another. I think we still kind of do that today. But unlike how they did it back then, we don't put spells and hexes on each other. We're just more passive aggressive and dislike comments on Facebook or say something mean real fast and ditch on out of there. Because face-to-face stuff, we don't do that. Now back to Zyto. It is believed that within Zyto's little black book were written many of these dark little impish spells as well as hexes to help those who were in need. Mrs. Dahlgren may have considered Zyto's sorcery profane, but wizardry was in his blood and he felt it was his calling. And he was a wizard of strong convictions. Sadly, one of those convictions would lead to his downfall. You see, Zyto believed that accepting payment for his sorcery would bring bad luck. But he was human. He was a mortal man. He lived in a humble little cabin with his wife and children. And to make money, he labored at making shingles. And that doesn't pay too well, especially when all these people are coming and wanting your spells and hexes to help them. They were just taking up a lot of his time. And that may be why the wizard resorted to using his spell book to help himself. You see, Zyto's conjuring book, as I said, was written in German and very cryptic. But he was financially challenged, so he did something desperate. He had his notorious spellbook translated into English and sold in Boonesboro by a printer named Josiah Nodal. Upon the printing, they sold hundreds of copies. Unfortunately, this breach of the wizard's code seemed to be a hex of its own upon the sorcerer. Zyto remained impoverished, demoralized. He began to charge for his services. Dahlgren wrote in 1882 that being old and very poor, he was persuaded to ask for a fee. And when he did so, he had even more bad luck. The 1870 census listed the wizard's age at 71, his occupation as day laborer, and his property value below that of any of his neighbors or family. The not-so-charmed life of wizard Zyto ended in poverty and regret in 1877. Dahlgren wrote, "It is said that he expired in great agony of soul." He was buried with no fanfare in an unmarked tomb amongst the graves of his family. As far as I could find in my research of this mysterious wizard, there is no real evidence that Zyto ever put a whammy or destructive spell on somebody he disliked. Perhaps Dahlgren's disapproval of Zyto stemmed from her devotion to God, and she was biased from the start because of the title of wizard being thrown about. So what can we make of the man Michael Zittle? Was he a man who cared for those around him and used his knowledge and gifts to help? Or was he a dark practitioner working within the shadows of South Mountain? Dependent on which history books you read, he might very well be a little of both. Either way, he is a character that helped breathe life into the mystic and mysterious folklore of South Mountain and early America. He is definitely an individual we should not let get forgotten. Well, at this time, it looks like I need to add this story to my files. Remember, as always, stay safe and keep searching.
The Fedora Files. Check out FedoraCRT.com today.